We were talking last time about the DSM-5, which is basically the guidebook for people that are dealing with different types of behavior, helping psychologists understand different types of abnormal behavior and being able to diagnose it and label it and figure out how to help the person. So let's actually move on to letter C, labels. A guy by the name of David Rosenhan did a study where he investigated the power of labels. Now you might be like, what do you mean by labeling? It would be like seeing a whole bunch of people playing sports and saying, well, they're just dumb jocks. Or a bunch of people working on, engineers working on a problem, and you're like, oh, they're just a bunch of big nerds. That's a label that you give to someone. So here's what they did, trying to figure out how powerful labels can be. He and others actually faked their way into a psychiatric hospital saying that they heard voices in their head. Once they were admitted, they acted normal and said the voices were gone. The label they had was the diagnosis of schizophrenia or manic depression. So the people that were diagnosing them, the doctors, the psychiatric hospital workers, had actually labeled them with schizophrenia even though they actually showed no current symptoms of that. However, once they were labeled with the diagnosis of schizophrenia or manic depressive, this label stuck with them, and it was very hard to remove the stigma and the eventual discrimination against those individuals. People continued to treat them the same way. And even though they acted perfectly fine, people in the back of their head had already labeled them as this, and so therefore, kind of almost like the self-fulfilling prophecy, that would be part of this. But more than anything, it was just the label that this person acts this way, and so therefore it sticks with them. Labels do have benefits, such as helping individuals to better understand their own behavior. So if you are labeled as schizophrenic and you do actually have schizophrenia, it can actually help you figure out how to combat some of the symptoms of that and basically be able to deal with it. It can also help predict future behaviors. You know what situation, if you are labeled as a person who has Asperger's or somebody who has autism, then what it would be able to do is help that individual understand their own behavior, but also predict future behaviors, knowing that in a certain scenario, a person who has autism might act in a certain way. Now, as well as allowing for clear communication about mental health professionals, a mental health professional can say, okay, this person has autism, let's work on how to assist them in creating a life that would be one that they would enjoy, and one would be a life that would not be as troublesome to them as possibly it could be if you did not diagnose what the situation was. And so, anyway, you have to understand that labels are not just dealing with abnormal behavior. Imagine if we talked about this a little bit earlier, and kind of, like I said, just kind of deal with the self-fulfilling prophecy, is the fact that if I found out that you guys are all coming into my psychology class are all idiots, and you have been called idiots since you were in the 6th grade, and basically told you have zero potential, then you know what's going to end up happening? As I get into that classroom, I'm going to kind of have that label stick with you, and I'm not perhaps going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And it could obviously work on the positive side of things, or if everybody says you are ripe with talent, as we've talked about in last chapters, that I might treat you differently than that way. So again, labels are very, very powerful things. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about models of abnormal behavior, basically meaning the different approaches to how people deal with abnormal behavior. The medical viewpoint, okay, or the medical model of abnormal behavior, sometimes called the organic model, but medical is probably the most well known here, proposes that mental illness originates in the mind and body due to some internal disease or injury. It could be systemic injury or an infectious injury, or external injury such as trauma. And so what they would do is the medical model would actually view mental illness as a disease that requires medical care. They would say that maybe a football player who constantly gets concussions, that would lead to abnormal behavior. And they would say that it is an external injury that has caused the actual problem, the actual abnormal behavior, and you can diagnose it that way. And so they would say it's dealing with internal disease, maybe something that's happening inside your body, maybe a chemical reaction, which kind of deals a little bit with biological. We'll get to that in a second. But that's what they would blame it on. Now, it developed during the Renaissance time period and the Scientific Revolution, which would basically be late Renaissance, would be 1400s, 1500s, I believe, and then Scientific Revolution would be in the 1700s. It replaced the belief that mental illness was caused by demonic possession. Yes, they used to believe that if you had a mental illness, you had a demon inside of you, and sometimes they would execute you to get rid of that demon, hopefully. The medical model is evident today, but mainly found in the biological approach. So the two kind of work together here. So medical is a little bit outdated, but again, you would be able to say that sometimes an injury, traumatic injury, can cause abnormal behavior. The biological model states that mental illness is related to physical differences in the brain in terms of structure and function, such as problems with specific neurotransmitters and neurons not firing correctly. And so they would actually blame it on certain things that were happening. They would actually blame it on certain things that were happening in your mind, like certain neurons were not being connected, certain neurons were not connecting to each other, and so therefore you were having problems. It explores how genetic predispositions influence mental illness. So basically, meaning if your parents have schizophrenia, there's a very good chance that you would have schizophrenia. If your parents were bipolar, there's a really good chance that you might be bipolar. And in the biological approach, family studies reveal inherited risks for specific mental illnesses, and basically meaning that you have like almost think of it like this. If you hear, whenever you go to the doctor, they might say, do your parents have heart disease, or do you have a family history of cancer? And that's what they're kind of talking about here. Brain imaging research demonstrates differences in brain structure. This would be like your MRIs, your CAT scans, those ones that we've talked about, and neurotransmitter function in individuals with mental illnesses. So what they would do is kind of see, okay, a person with disturbed behavior. What does their brain structure look like? What's happening in their brain when a certain action is taking place, versus somebody who is not acting that way? What their brain looks like. They would try to measure are certain neurotransmitters firing, acetylcholine, dopamine, those type of things. Are they firing in an individual? Are they not firing correctly? And so this is where you kind of hear people say some people have a chemical imbalance that causes this behavior. That approach would go back to this biological approach. Psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, you guys remember talking about this. This is dealing with Freud. Their explanation of mental illness is the result of unresolved, unconscious conflicts from childhood and sexual and aggressive urges or instincts, meaning they have certain things that are happening in your childhood that have been repressed, things that have been pushed back, and now as a result of it, you are firing up. You are upset, and so there you are. All of that pent up energy or pent up anger, aggression, sexual urges comes out, and that's why you act in an abnormal way. The modern psychodynamic perspective also focuses on how social interactions influence mental illness, how people can sometimes drive you to doing that, and how social interactions with others can influence it. So again, unresolved unconscious conflicts. Whenever you guys think of psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, you have to think of unresolved unconscious things that you can't necessarily see, you don't realize it's happening, but it's just something that overflows inside of you and eventually comes out in the way that you act. The humanist, they would say mental illness results from a lack of unconditional positive regard or self-acceptance and failure to genuinely and honestly evaluate one's own behavior. Now, hopefully you guys remember what unconditional positive regard is. What that is that your parents, that's authority figures, people that you believe should care for you, tell you that regardless of what you do, they still love you. They might not like your behavior, but they still love you. And so therefore, a humanist always goes back to that, because they would feel if you did not get enough love, if you did not get enough care, if you did not get enough help when you were younger, that this could lead to bad behavior in the future. And the fact that you weren't accepted in your circles, that could also lead to behavior. Perhaps failure in the past could lead to bad behavior. Think about it like this. This is one of the reasons the humanist psychologist, I think I'm saying that right, would be the ones that would say to younger kids playing AYSO soccer that everyone should get a trophy. And the reason why is because they want them to have positivity. They don't want them to feel like a failure. Their thought is that failure can doom a kid for the rest of their life. And so, looking at letter B, problems come from the inability to reach one's full potential due to being blocked by society. So perhaps you could be the greatest soccer player in the world, but because you didn't get a trophy or because you lost a game when you were 10, you decided to quit. And they would say you can't do that. So therefore, everybody should get something so that they all feel a part that that they're living a good life and that they're working hard and they're being rewarded for something. Humanism has been most effective in terms of treatment methods, but has been less useful in terms of providing explanation for severe forms of mental illness. Because somebody being perhaps bipolar or schizophrenic might not be able to lead back to how people were treated when they were younger, or maybe as a result of failure or a result of unconditional positive regard. There were people that come from families that had great backgrounds, that their parents loved them and grandparents loved them, and they were given every opportunity, and they still turn out to be perhaps bipolar. And as a result of them being bipolar, which means that you will go to a depressive state and then a manic state, like everything's crazy and crazy fast and happening a lot, that doesn't necessarily explain if somebody that came from that great background has bipolar or is bipolar, that might not explain this part of it. So again, humanists are looking after the person itself and saying the environmental factors could have a lot to do with it. Cognitive viewpoints of this, of mental illness or abnormal behavior, they stress the influence of thought processes on the development of mental illness. So basically, how you process, how your brain processes this information. And they would say that dysfunctional or maladaptive, which means like not good. If you remember, we talked about the different types of stress. We talked about adaptive and maladaptive. Dysfunctional or maladaptive cognitions are major factors that determine whether an individual will develop a mental illness. And so, if your brain cannot process why an action is or why something is happening, then that can also lead to abnormal behavior. And an individual's perception regarding the level of control they have over events and the attributions they make to explain what happens to them influence whether or not psychological disorders will develop or persist. So if you believe, remember we talked about external locus of control and internal locus of control, if you are an external locus of control person, then you believe that the environment is what's always constantly bringing you down, and that can actually cause a psychological disorder. If you're an internal locus of control, meaning you feel like you can control everything, then you believe that it's now your fault and that you're having the problem of processing this. So again, it's just how your brain processes the information, like how you diagnose a problem, would be part of the cognitive side of things. Behaviorist social learning, these individuals would believe that abnormal behavior is learned in the same way as most other human behavior, through classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and modeling. So basically, if you are having an abnormal behavior, it's because you've seen other people do it and you model that behavior. So think of it like this. If a boy grows up in a home where there is domestic abuse, where the dad beats the mom, then he gets a wife or he gets a girlfriend, he gets a family, he does the same thing. A behaviorist would say that this person has learned this social behavior from another person and is acting in an abnormal way because it is what they're used to, it's what they've seen. Biopsychosocial. This is kind of a mix. This is a modern psychology approach that combines the biological, meaning the genes and brain structure, psychosocial and social perspective to explain a given situation. Basically, what they're saying is abnormal behavior can come from a lot of different sources, is kind of what that means. The most recent DSM, the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, includes information regarding the influence of culture in terms of prevalence and observed symptoms associated with various psychological disorders. And so now they're kind of saying the culture can actually drive you to acting in an abnormal way. If the culture is exceedingly violent, it might make you want to be exceedingly violent. If the culture is exceedingly aggressive, it might make you be exceedingly aggressive. And so that's kind of where these psychological disorders come from. So these are just the different approaches to abnormal behavior and kind of explaining why some people act the way that they do. Again, you do not have to, you can take a little bit from each of these because all of these seem to make sense. It just kind of depends on what school of psychology you might be coming from to explain abnormal behavior. That's it.